Hello, everyone. My name is Christian Klein. I'm the technical product owner and data protection officer at Elasticys. And we are building, operating, and supporting a Kubernetes-based application platform called Welkin for software critical to society. Think healthcare and energy and all the usual stuff we take for granted because we're living in a democratic country. And Welkin is not only focusing on compliance and security, but it also has a really cute mascot. Yay. And it's all about software critical to society that I want to talk about today. As you heard in the introduction, 2025. What a year. I have no clue how your social media posts look like, but this is the kind of stuff I get on my feed. Dystopic AI-generated imagery, which essentially suggests that, well, the president on the other side of the pond can essentially shut down Europe, digitally speaking, whenever he just presses the button, right? But he can't really do that now. He wouldn't, right? Well, it was all fun and games until this article popped up, where apparently he didn't really like something that somebody in the International Criminal Court said, and then apparently he did click the button and somebody's email account got suspended, disrupting the operations of that organization. So if he does that for somebody in the ICC, can he do that for the Prime Minister of Denmark or of Sweden? I don't know, but nevertheless, this freaked out everybody in Europe. And more stuff, and the Norwegian and the Danish authorities simply had to react. And pretty much they said, like, well, it's not like you need to get out now, but have an exit strategy, right? And sorry if this talk gets too political, but since we're in Denmark, I kind of need to get it out of my system. If you are forced into a big real estate deal, you probably don't want your buyer to have this leverage of, unplugging your government IT. Just saying. But okay, let's stop politics and talk a little bit more platform engineering. And what can we do about this? Well, hopefully you have managed to convince your organization to adopt Kubernetes and Cloud Native organizations, which of course makes already an exit strategy a lot easier. But Kubernetes is really not an exit strategy by itself, right? It doesn't write migration plans for you. There's still a lot of stuff that needs to happen around Kubernetes. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk to you about, I'm going to give you a guideline of how to iteratively draft a migration plan. And just out of curiosity, how many of you are a fan of Inception? Awesome. So just for you guys, I made sure that this talk is actually structured like a migration plan. So I recommend to think about a successful migration in 5 phases, which are 0 index. And this can, in fact, be the sections that you're filling in a document that you're working on iteratively. And you have the phase 0, plan migration, pre-migration phase, migration execution. So this is, the critical window where downtime is happening and angry customers are potentially calling in. Post-migration, and just in case stuff doesn't quite go as you expected, well, roll back plan and get back to square one. And I'm going to go through all of these sections, how you produce them, how you can think about them one by one. So let me start with the plan migration phase. This is where you kind of settle the boundaries, right? Or if you're an architect, the system context of your migration. So you want to very quickly clarify to set a scope for the migration, right? You're probably not going to migrate all applications at once because there's just too much time and too risky and things like that. You probably want to migrate a few applications in one batch if they're very similarly or if they're very tightly coupled or if the migration steps are very similar. And it doesn't really matter exactly how many applications you migrate at once or not, but what really matters is that you clarify for this particular migration project what is in scope and what is out of scope. Once you have determined that, it's time to make a migration assessment. You kind of want to look at what is the technological stack in the old environment, and you want to look at what's the technological environment, tech stack in the new environment, and you want to do a gap analysis to match them, right? So if you're, for example, say migrating from Postgres to Postgres, then that's probably, a walk in the park, nothing to see here. If you're migrating from, Microsoft SQL to Postgres, well, if your application uses a lot of query builders, that also should work rather smoothly, right? Whereas I heard stories, if you have heavily invested in stored procedures and whatnot, well, That's not going to be that easy. But on the positive side, it's 2025, we have Gen AI, so maybe that can convert, I don't know, magically stored procedures into some kind of language of your choice. Who knows? The next thing you want to clarify is who are your stakeholders? So essentially, who are the people or roles that influence or will be influenced by your migration? And well, users and customers are obvious stakeholders, but maybe QA also wants to be part of this because they have some really nice tests to run at the very end to make sure that, you know, everything is working as expected. Maybe the product team wants to double check some dashboards to make sure that, well, analytics still works and no weird user activities happening. What about, marketing? Maybe they want to monitor some communities, some community forums to make sure that nobody starts to complain about, hey, I have this edge case which suddenly appeared, and so on and so forth. And you might even go as far as to, onboard and have a direct line of communication with one of your key customers because, well, if the migration was successful for them, then there's a high chance that it was successful for all of your customers and you're avoiding a little bit of disappointment down the path. So once you have identified your stakeholders, it's important to also clarify the external timeline, right? As the joke goes, you don't really want to migrate an e-commerce website on Black Friday. Maybe there is a migration window that you can use in order to comfortably fit this kind of migration. A maintenance window in which you can comfortably fit the migration. But otherwise, maybe you just need to agree on, okay, do we do this over the weekend? Do we do this in the evening? Or maybe I don't know, wake up a little bit earlier on a Wednesday and do the migration then. It doesn't really matter what is the choice here, but what matters is that all the stakeholders and everybody is aligned so as to, avoid you being caught between a rock and a hard place. Awesome. Now, when you're done, you can actually, save this document. Depending on how bureaucratic your organization is and how important this migration is, you might actually go as far as, call this document version 0.1 and, formally get it approved through upper management. But of course, if you're a small organization, then maybe just sharing the Google Docs link in Slack and getting some thumbs up is good enough, right? But I would definitely recommend you to make sure that you get it reviewed because this really sets the boundary of the migration. Great. Let's not go to the pre-migration phase. And the goal of this phase is really twofold. First of all, you want to reduce the critical window, the actual migration as much as possible by doing as much as possible before the actual migration when customers feel the downtime. And secondly, you want to produce the actual migration steps. Now, the way I recommend you to think about it is to, quote, migrate your old environment onto a staging environment which looks very, very similar to your future production environment. It might actually be the exact same hardware or exact same, account ID and whatnot. But for now, this is just a staging environment. And I don't really believe in this being a one-shot process. I rather believe in this nice metaphor called the build, measure, learn feedback loop. So you really want to put yourself in a very tight such loop. So let me now go through what you do in each of the steps, of the 3 steps in this loop. So in the build loop, in the build step, you're actually filling out the section 2 of this document, migration execution. And I'm a very big fan of the checklist manifesto, which executive summary of that book, or sorry, spoiler alert for that book, it pretty much argues that we humans suck at complexity, but we invent this amazing tool called checkboxes, checklist in order to make everything from aviation to surgery a lot safer, so we don't forget something very important. And now I understand that some of you are like, oh, checklist, man, this is a platform engineering conference. Yes, I agree with you. But think about it this way. It's very unlikely that you will migrate this exact application from this exact old environment to this exact new environment. So yes, you might want to write code, but aim for just enough code so as to de-risk the migration process and to make sure that it fits in the migration window. But I would say that anything more than that, I don't know, I wouldn't rewrite the Kubernetes operator just for that. So what does a typical migration look like? Well, this depends very much on your application, but let's assume that you have an application like highlighted on the top where you have a stateless part, right? Maybe a bunch of pods, and then you have the state stored in a database such as PostgreSQL and an object storage something S3 compatible, for example. Well, your first step, and then you have the old environment on the top and the new environment on the bottom. The first step you want to do is usually, disable traffic to the old application to make sure that writes are no longer happening. You then want to incrementally copy data, and I really have to focus on the word incrementally here, because the amount of data you need to transfer might be your bottleneck in how quickly you can execute this migration. Then you deploy your application, and you reroute the traffic to your new production environment. Now, of course, we're here still in pre-migration, so you're not going to actually disable traffic to application. And when I say rerouting traffic, you probably just point your browser to a new DNS entry, but you get a little bit the gist. So once you have built this checklist, then it's time to go to the measure step and to really see, is this actually working? And I highly recommend here not to have like the certified Kubernetes administrators mindset, where you can kind of just improvise and fix things as they're going, right? So we're not here doing the ScanNet challenge during a migration, but rather you want to think more like an airline captain, like reroute traffic, check, deploy this application, check, and things like that. You want this to be as brainless as possible, because migration can be stressful. It's not sure that you will be able in that moment to use the smartest parts of your brain. So once you have measured if your checklist is actually working properly, it's time to sit back a little bit and reflect, what have you learned out of this? And if you still feel that some steps are still very tricky, well, then add them to the migration plan. You also have to wonder, is the real migration actually going to be as simple as just replace staging with new production? And here are two things that I usually get bumped into. First of all, too high DNS time to live, where if your time to live is 1 hour and you have a 1-hour migration window, that's not going to end up very good. And then sometimes also content delivery networks tend to cache things they didn't intend them to, and then they start to invalidate in cache after you did a migration. So these are things that you should probably put some extra energy into thinking about them. Any tricky steps? Well, write a little bit more code to make them a little bit simpler. Does anything still feel tricky, although you wrote all the code necessary? Well, consider having a check in the section 3 post-migration phase. Also look at how much time it took you to actually execute the migration, and also think about, okay, so what if things don't work as intended? What's the latest I can still activate my rollback plan, and what should be the rollback plan? So if any of these questions don't have quite the best answers, no worries, just go back to the build step. But otherwise, if you only need a migration plan and not to actually perform the migration, you're pretty much done, right? Just make this version 1 of your document, get another round of reviews and approval, and you're pretty much done. Unfortunately, it might be that you actually have to execute the migration, and then you actually have to read section 2 of your migration plan. And the way I like this to look like I said, checklist, right? Notify internal stakeholders. You don't want to codify a call to your Slack API, but maybe a canned message makes sense here. Disable traffic, check. Copy over new data, check, check, check. Notify internal stakeholders that migration is completed, check. What is the most important thing to do after you have completed this checklist? Well, I would recommend you to just take it easy, breathe in and breathe out, and meditate for 2 minutes. Because if the migration was successful, you totally deserve it. And if the migration was unsuccessful, well, you're probably pretty stressed and pretty pumped. So you're only going to make things worse. So those 2 minutes are, time well invested in downtime. Let me put it like that. Good. Now, like I said, you're trying to make the migration as short as possible by moving things to pre-migration or to post-migration. So you're not really done with migration yet. There's still a lot of stuff done to, the customers won't notice downtime anymore. And from their point of view, migration is good as done. But there are still a few steps that are left to be done. And this is what leads me to the post-migration phase. So when exactly was this section drafted? Well, like I said, some of the stakeholders probably added a few plus ones, right? Like, hey, I'm QA, I want to check what you have done after migration. Hey, I'm marketing, I kind of want to click a little bit around to make sure our demo still works. But you probably build this up also during the pre-migration phase, and well, hopefully, but hopefully not, if something didn't quite feel well during migration execution, I don't know, something just felt a little bit slow, or maybe you had an error that you weren't quite expecting, but it didn't really feel fatal to the point where you roll back, then it's best to just add another check into this section. And I like to think about the items here in 3 categories: testing, follow-ups, deprecation, and removal. So when it comes to testing, it's pretty much as simple as it sounds. Let QA do QA. Check analytics, logs, and metrics, either for increase in errors or for decrease in usage, because they both can be indicators of something not quite having worked during migration. Call your key customer and check with them. And also try to check the applications that are outside the scope of the migration, like, hey, have they noticed anything being different? Or do you need to check there that maybe some URL or connection string or credentials haven't quite been updated accordingly? Then I'm sure that you have plenty of follow-ups, right? So an example of a follow-up would be to point your CI/CD pipeline to the new environment, right? And here I would actually suggest you to, I don't know, push a trivial change like rename Hello World to Hello World 2, push it everything through the pipeline and see, is my new production environment being changed, and hopefully not the old production environment. You also want to check if backups are still working. And then if you have one of those ETL pipelines, which tends to integrate very deeply into your database and whatnot, well, now is the time to check if it's still working. Otherwise, somebody will probably hunt you down in the next 24 hours, and you'll find out then that it hasn't worked yet. And finally, deprecation and removal. You don't want to do this probably immediately, just in case you missed something, and just to make sure that you still have a bit of an exit path in case something didn't quite go during migration as needed. But at some point, maybe 1 or 2 weeks later, you also have to do deprecation and removal. And this is not only to avoid confusion, to avoid the old environment suddenly coming back to life and then traffic being rerouted to it, but also because as a data protection officer, I really feel a strong urge to inform you about GDPR right to be forgotten, right? So you don't want somebody who asks you to forget about their identity to suddenly pop up because their data is still in the old environment. Please remove it, right? And then if you talk to your CFO, they will be very happy to hear, like, we're reducing costs by shutting down the old environment. Yay. All right. Hopefully, you don't need this section, but it's better to have it than not to have it. And here there is a saying that I really like, failure to prepare is preparing to failure. And this is why I really think that the migration plan needs to also have a rollback plan. Why that? Well, first of all, it really forces you to think with rollback in mind and with risk minimization in mind. This is a little bit like, I don't know, if you're doing test-driven development, this kind of forces you to write code which is testable and makes testing a lot easier, right? So that's the same concept also with rollback plan. Just the fact that you're drafting it, you're having it, and you're noticing that it's very complicated forces you to reduce risk and to make the rollback a lot easier. But it also allows all of the stakeholders to very early on agree, okay, what should we do if this doesn't work? Should we just roll forward because we really want to get done with migration? Or should we roll back because, hey, we have a few key customers, they are, we had a few incidents, our relationship is kind of weak with them, let's not stress them more than necessary, right? And you don't really want to take these decisions, in the heat of the migration and in the migration execution when you're already super stressed. Yeah, and the place when this section appeared is usually during planned migration, where initial scaffold appeared, right? When you agreed with all the stakeholders what to do and what not to do, but also during the pre-migration phase, during the build step. All right, you're done with migration. Congratulations. That being said, I still propose you to do this one last thing, which is organize a lesson learned session with the team that did the migration, and perhaps even with a few stakeholders. And why is that? Well, because we don't know what's happening on the side of the Atlantic, but maybe this is not your last migration. Maybe there will be other applications that you need to migrate. So in that case, you want to spread knowledge across the organization to make sure that other migrations will be as successful as yours. You also want to sell your hard work internally, because a little bit like we had in the meeting yesterday with chaos engineering, right? We give out to our users certain things that they end up just taking for granted, and it's very difficult to justify our value as platform engineers. And honestly, if a migration works successfully, nobody notices, which is kind of sad about migrations, right? So this is why it's really important to, sell a little bit your work internally by saying all the hurdles and all the work that you had to put up to make it successful. And also, this is also very likely going to make future migrations a lot easier. To sum up, 2025 is a really weird year. I suggest that you all prepare to migrate your workloads because, well, you'll thank yourself later if you already have a plan for that. And then I presented you how a typical migration plan should look like with these 5 zero-indexed sections. Thank you very much for your attention. If you want to know more information about how to draft a migration plan, scan this QR code to read the full blog post. And if you want to connect with me, we're on LinkedIn, where I talk more about Kubernetes, information security, regulations, and digital sovereignty. Do scan this QR code. Thank you very much.